Thank you very much for this, Francesco. And I would like to start acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians and owners of this land. And I would like to pay my respect to the elders past and present on whose land we now stand. And as Francesco said, my research is part of a much bigger project, which is Mapping Edges. Mapping Edges is a transdisciplinary research studio. So if I slip into the we every now and then, it's not a pluralis majestatis, but it is because my research is collaborative. The writing isn't, but the research in itself is collaborative. So we is me and my co-researchers. So my current project takes place on Wangal and Gadigal land, which is also known as Inner West Sydney. It explores situated sustainabilities. So ways in which people are already producing sustainable solutions to urban living, and ways that are generally not seen or recognized because they're seen either as cultural practices of migrant groups or as lifestyle choices. And what we are saying is that no, they already exist, and we need to build on this, existing practices. And I thought of talking a bit about our methodologies because they will give you an idea on the rest of the paper. So we do a lot of walking as research. So these walks are iterative, so we tend to walk in the same place many times, and they give us they help us to identify human and non-human participants and issues of concern. While we walk, we take a lot of photo documentations that we then Instagram in real time as an example of visual ethnography. And this initial research allows us to formulate questions for our oral histories. And our oral histories sometimes are, sometimes are walking oral histories, sometimes they are prompted by things like seeds exchange, like you see here. And we take, of course, oral history in pretty much in the same way as it is described by Alessandro Portelli as a work of relationships between past and present, memory and narrative, interviewer and interviewee, and orality and written or recorded narrative. And unlike other forms of interviews, oral histories allow for the collaborative generation of knowledge between the researcher and the research participants. So we do regard oral histories as co-creation. So we narrativize them because nobody likes to have the transcripts of their oral histories made public. They're quite awful. In doing so, we work with our research participants. They do the editing. We do a first edit, and then they do their own edit. So it is really about co-creation. And also we think of plants as participants in these interviews and in this co-creation because they often prompt moments of realization, memories, or they lead us to consider the sensory aspects of gardens. As you can see here, there is a lot of touching, picking, sniffing, and eating when you are in a garden. And this is important, and it is important because paying attention to the sensory dimension is relevant to studies of multicultural situations, and Sydney is clearly multicultural. So, and it is important to explore how cultural practices shape and are shaped by engagements with regimes of the senses. So anthropologist David House calls this the social and sensory bundle. And sociologist Amanda Wise in Sydney has conducted a study in the same area where we are working, showing that everyday practices are based on habitus and on sensory regimes. And while dealing, with differing sensory regimes is when you start to have clashes or, discomfort more than clashes among different groups. And the same we find goes for gardening. So here I'll start with my first story to illustrate this. It goes like this. We have a lot of Italian gardeners here in Haberfield, and there are a couple of controversies. One Italian gardener is really upset because he enters the Haberfield Association garden competition every year and never wins. This is the garden. Because his style of gardening is not federation, this is this is a federation house in Haberfield, which was the first garden suburb in the world. My quote continues. So we are talking as the gardening committee about having a separate section for the competition for Italian gardening, an Italian gardening category. So the solution is to separate. This story was told to me by an Italian gardener, another Italian gardener, a second generation Italian gardener, and we'll get back to her later. Her parents arrived from Treviso, moved to North Queensland where the father was a cane cutter, and then they bought a tobacco farm. So she grew up in tropical North Queensland, and then went to university, had a fabulous career, bought an enormous house in Haberfield, and she's an amazing gardener. And for me, this story is important because it really changed the way that I looked at Italian Australian gardens. It made me understand the diversity of Italian Australian gardens. So, this is an example of a semi-federation garden, and this is the Italian garden. This is why he doesn't win, because it is quite, it is aesthetically quite different. And this story is a very good example of tension between Anglo-Australian gardening style and the Italian gardens, and also between different heritage traditions, and between contrasting placemaking practices and different aesthetic sensibilities. And with aesthetics, I mean that which pertains to the senses. And I chose to start with this story because it prompted me to think about gardening in relation to transculturation and placemaking, which is the focus of this paper. And there are a lot of other matters that could be arising from this project, but I will keep it focused. And how Italian migrants make place has been one of my continuing theme in my research on Italians and Italian Australians in Sydney. And I generally do this looking at the relationship with material culture and everyday practices. And gardening is one of these everyday practices. So my thinking about transculturation is guided by mainly by two theories. One is Mary-Louise Pratt, to which we own the idea of contact zone, and the other one is Silvia Spitta, to whom I own the idea of misplacement. So the contact zone is the coming together of people, histories, and cultures previously separated by geography and history. And with misplacement, Silvia Spitta talks about the how things that travel from one place to another start to engender changes and some disturbance in the order of things, the existing order of things. And she talks about the creative reshuffling that happens when you have something that is misplaced. So my argument, therefore, is that Italian-Australian gardens are contact zones that make present transcultural processes in various ways. So as remixes of established cultural and environmental landscapes, as you see here, as translation of other places in a new environment, and as material and sensory entanglements between humans and plants, things and animals. I'll tell you another story. And to situate this argument, I use the definition of migrant gardens. And those are gardens made by migrants and by misplaced plant or migrant plants. So as I was preparing this presentation, I work at home, I look over my little tiny garden, and there is this new addition that is a fern. And this fern was given to me by a friend, Joseph, who is here. And it is the offspring of a fern that Joseph's fathers brought from Italy when it was still possible. It's not possible now. And for me, it means a lot. It comes with a lot of different trajectories. So there is and a lot of entangled effects as well. So there is the story from father to son, then to me. There is the care that this plant has had for decades in Sydney, the promise of flavors that I really haven't tasted in a long time. And also the plant itself, the soil, the bacteria, the fungi that come with the plant. So these trajectories and the relation that they generate between localities, effects, and people, and the material and sensory dimension they create are a key for me to understand transcultural placemaking. So in the stories of Italian-Australian gardeners, gardens are described as fundamental components of their homes. Not simply in real estate terms, but there is that because we are in Sydney, but also as a symbolic and material sites that make settling and the sense of feeling at home, what Sarah Hamed calls regrounding, possible. So gardening is important in this context because it generates place and belonging through a continuum of practices and sensory words. With continuum, I don't mean the repetition of the same, but I mean adjustments, the creative reshuffling that Spitta talks about, remix of disparate elements, and translations. So some plants translate others. And here we have an olive tree and a mango tree. And the mango tree as a translator. So what it translates is sweetness, yellowness, juiciness of summer stone fruits. In Sydney, you cannot grow peaches because it is too hot and because there are fruit flies and the fruit flies spoil the fruit. So instead of growing peaches, people grow mangoes. So this is an example of translation. And this adjustment also is reflected at a linguistic level. So for instance, one of the gardeners, the owner of this garden, we spoke to, used words from her Italian repertoire to talk about la masseria, la terra, because they don't have an equivalent in English, or they can be translated as farmhouse, but it fails to convey the special relations between the house and the land and the farm animal and so on and so forth. And similarly, other words that cropped up are examples of translanguaging, for instance, defensa, blocco, and yarda, which are the fence, the block, and the backyard. And these words are not just semiotic innovations, they capture material transformations of things that do not exist in Italian gardens in Italy because there is no fence, there is no backyard. Vegetables are grown in the orto. the author is not attached to the house. It's normally at some distance and so on and so forth. So, I find this is quite an interesting way to think about it, and a series of readjustments. So vegetables are grown in the backyard because you couldn't grow them at the front, otherwise you were a real wog and so on. So plant entanglements also mediate social processes and social relations, and for instance through the sharing of crops, of cuttings, and here you see someone who has a lot of cuttings, or seeds, and also the gardening competition I mentioned at the beginning, and there are a lot of over the fences conversations, which at times are conflictual. So plants and humans are entangled, and plants function as an assembling point or assembling artifact, and I'm quoting here for a couple of my colleagues who talk about assembling artifacts as conduits that mediate across geographies, environments, and histories, and create new meanings and relations at the intersection of people and social practices. Now, prickly pear is one of such plants. You see it here, it's a Opuntia picus indica, and it is classified as a noxious weed in Australia. And it was used to make fences. Yeah. Okay, so for me it's quite interesting, this. In one of our oral histories it becomes a metonym for South Italy, and the divide north-south that is reproduced in some migrant communities. And it goes like this. So, and this is the first gardener I spoke about. There were Sicilians who lived here before me, and they had their typical prickly pears and their fig trees. They had citrus trees. The citrus trees I have relocated along the fence, what I call my orchard. I got rid of all the prickly pears because I am from northern Italy, so prickly pears are not something that I particularly like. So, that flavor and sensory regimes are associated with the plant and are associated also to being from the south or the north, and there is a lot of, there are quite a lot of class connotations as well in here. So I don't need to grow vegetables because I can go and buy them. The story goes on with explaining the cultural differences in the suburb. She has basically this fence that you see, the prickly pear, the gorse, and the olive trees are of her Sicilian neighbor, and she has really old established trees that shed leaf on the Sicilian neighbor's orchard, and he is really not happy. She doesn't want to cut down the trees because it is her contribution to the environment, because she maintains a tree canopy which is a green corridor for native birds. So there are all these really interesting conflicts in civic attachment in this. Okay, yes. So to conclude, and adopting a transcultural point of view and reading gardens as contact zones where plants generate remixes, translations, and entanglements reveals that migrant gardens are not sites where sensory worlds from other places, in this case Italy, are recreated. They are instead sites of complex entanglements and of cultural, social, and environmental mediation. They are deeply localized and produced in that creative reshuffling of Australian geology and climate, Italian horticultural knowledge, people, cultivated plants, and plants that decide to grow spontaneously, sometimes they decided not to grow, soil, small animals, wildlife, and also, architectonic styles. Here you see a Federation House with the white picket fence and very, if you want, Anglo-looking lavender and roses. And then you have the mango and the olive trees. So this is a creative remix of what I'm an example of the creative remix I am talking about. And this is important for me because through this I can read the wider history of migration, of Italian migration, and also the social relation in a multicultural suburb. Thank you.